The cold wind whistled through the old bus window frame, carrying the scent of dry earth and a profound dread that had followed me for 30 years. I stared at the first city lights blurring past, and a quiet, chilling thought materialized. It was time I faced them, the family of the person Ethan loved, yet the people who held my secret captive. I had lived in seclusion in our small wooden house in the country, raising my son with silence and unvoiced promises. Ethan was about to marry Chloe Sterling, a girl from another world, a world of power and high finance. I knew that if I showed up as the real Eleanor, they would be guarded. So, I chose the worn dress, the simple demeanor, and a story about a humble, widowed mother. It was all an act, a necessary disguise so I could observe, to search for a buried truth. The old Greyhound bus wasn't just moving forward, it felt like it was pulling me out of time itself. I watched the rolling hills of the countryside flatten out, the familiar dark green of the pine forests giving way to endless concrete. The air inside was thick and warm, smelling of stale coffee and other people's long, tired journeys. I pressed my forehead against the cool windowpane. My small town, my quiet life, was receding into a small, cherished memory. I didn't look back. There was nothing to look back at, really, except the small, empty farmhouse and the cold, quiet certainty of what I had to do. It was a journey I hadn't wanted to take for 30 years. A journey to meet the people who belonged to the world I had deliberately stayed away from. The world Ethan was now ready to embrace. I had to see their faces. I had to know. I adjusted the worn canvas bag on my lap. Inside, there was just enough for the fare, a change of clothes, and the heavy weight of my carefully constructed lie. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused, marked by yard work and the sun. They looked honest. They were meant to look honest. The sun was already high when we reached the metropolitan outskirts. The light changed completely. It became harsh, reflected off glass and polished chrome, brittle. In the mountains, light filters. It moves slowly through the leaves of the oaks. Here, it just slams into you. The terminal was a riot of noise and hurried movement. People spoke quickly, their voices sharp and demanding. I stepped down onto the pavement. The ground was flat, smooth, and impersonal. It didn't have the comforting texture of home, the soft earth that gave way underfoot. I felt suddenly dizzy, displaced. Like a piece of simple river stone washed up on a strange, marble shore. I pulled the collar of my faded cotton dress higher. It was a pale yellow, washed so many times the fabric felt thin against my skin. I had chosen it carefully. It wasn't quite clean enough to be new, nor ragged enough to demand pity. It was just, worn. I wanted to be seen, but not truly observed. An invisible mother from a life that didn't matter to this city. This act, this costume, was my armor. It kept the real me, the watchful, wounded me, safe inside. I found a quiet corner near a pillar and waited for Ethan's call. The air here didn't smell of pine or rain. It smelled of exhaust fumes and the cold, metallic scent of success. Everything here felt like it had a price tag. Even the silence was expensive. I closed my eyes for a moment, just to anchor myself to the memory of the wind across the open porch. When I opened them, the city rushed back in. Skyscrapers that seemed to lean in, judging my presence. Ethan called. His voice was bright, excited. He didn't hear the tension in my breath. "Mom, you're here? Chloe's waiting for you at the curb. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, son," I said. The lie tasted like dust. Just a little tired. The city is very vast. He laughed. A good, honest laugh. I held on to that sound. It was the only real thing in this whole cold place. He didn't know the game I was playing. He would never know. He only deserved happiness. I told him I'd call when I was ready to leave. I had to face them alone first. I had to walk the path of the past alone. I found the rideshare car, a polished black SUV that felt too luxurious for me to touch. Chloe was there. She was taller than I'd imagined, dressed in clothes that looked deceptively casual, but the fabric hung perfectly. She smiled. It was a practiced smile, polite. But something in her eyes didn't quite reach it. "Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth and low. "Thank you for making the long drive." I nodded slowly, letting the simplicity of my action speak for my lack of words. I let my eyes widen just a little, taking in the car, the clean street. I needed to appear overwhelmed. "It's very modern," I managed, my voice pitched slightly too softly, too breathy. She didn't look at me with curiosity, but with a kind of distant, almost sad understanding. As if she understood what it meant to leave a quiet place. This was an unexpected layer. I had prepared for contempt, for polite dismissal. Not for this quiet, shared melancholy. The drive to their home was silent. Chloe spoke only once, pointing out a large glass tower. "My father's firm is headquartered there." I just stared at the building. It was so high, it seemed to pierce the sky. A power that felt absolute. I turned away from the glass. I looked at the reflection of my own face in the side window. It was obscured by the speed and the light, a blurred image of worry. I reached for my bag again, clutching the strap until my knuckles were white. I thought about the secret. A fragile thing, buried like a stone in my heart, that I was now carrying into this fortress of glass and confidence. The deception felt necessary. If I had come as the woman I truly was, the sharp, perceptive woman who had survived loss and built a new life from nothing, they would have been guarded. But a poor, simple mother from the country? They would lower their defenses. They would talk down to me, perhaps, or simply ignore me. They would be careless. And carelessness was what I was looking for. A tiny crack in the perfectly smooth facade. The car stopped. Not outside a house, but a tall, elegant high-rise. A valet in a uniform opened the door for me. I forced myself to stumble slightly as I got out. A small, subtle performance of being out of my depth. Chloe offered her arm, but I politely declined with a slight shake of my head. I didn't want physical contact. I needed to maintain the distance. We walked across a pristine lobby. The floor was polished marble that reflected the light like water. It felt cold, even through the worn soles of my sneakers. I let my eyes wander over the expensive sculpture on the wall, a look of quiet bewilderment on my face. It was all an attempt to disappear into the role of the guest. The elevator ride was the longest part. Just the two of us, rising silently through the building. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and something else, something synthetic and clean. I could hear my own breathing, steady and low. Chloe looked at her phone, avoiding eye contact. A small act of relief for me. She was allowing me to be silent. The elevator door opened onto a private hallway that was just as silent, just as polished. Their apartment door was dark wood, heavy and solid. A fortress, not a doorway. I felt a sudden, sharp tremor of fear. But it wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the fear of what I might uncover inside. Chloe used a key card and a numeric code. The small beeping sound echoed loudly in the private vestibule. The door swung inward slowly, revealing a space of expansive white walls and curated shadows. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the past felt closer than the present. The temperature was cool, controlled. There was no warmth here, no smell of baking or wood smoke, only the faint, clean scent I'd noticed in the elevator. Mrs. Vivian Sterling came forward. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored slacks and silk blouse perfect. She extended a hand. I took it gently. Her hand was soft, almost unnaturally smooth. My rough, dry palm against hers felt like a strange confession of labor. "Welcome, Eleanor," she said. Her voice was kind, perhaps too kind. It carried a slight, practiced formality. I simply nodded, dipping my head slightly. I didn't return the greeting with equal warmth. I let my simplicity stand for my reserve. She then introduced her husband, Mr. Marcus Sterling. He was a large man, solid and unyielding, wearing a blazer over a collared shirt. He looked at me over the top of his expensive, rimless glasses. His eyes were quick, assessing. He didn't smile with his eyes. He didn't offer his hand. A subtle dismissal. "We are very pleased Ethan is joining our family," he stated, his voice a low rumble of authority. I kept my gaze low, looking at the intricate rug pattern on the polished wooden floor. "He is a good boy. My boy." My brevity made the silence grow longer. It worked. They were waiting for me to say more, to stammer or apologize for my simple background. But I just stood still, a quiet, simple element in their glass empire. Mrs. Sterling stepped in smoothly, retrieving the conversation. "Please, come and sit down. The trip must have been exhausting." I followed them into the living room. Everything was spaced perfectly. There was a large, modern sculpture on a pedestal. Angular, full of sharp edges. It felt out of place with the overall calm, almost sterile atmosphere. I sat down on the edge of the large, cream-colored sectional. It was soft, too soft. I felt like I might sink into it. Mr. Sterling began to speak, not to me, but mostly to Ethan, who had just arrived, apologizing for his delay. He spoke about Ethan's future, his potential in the firm. He used terms I barely understood: mergers, acquisitions, market capitalization. I listened, maintaining the simple, slightly bewildered expression. But my mind was sharp, sharp as a piece of broken glass. I was watching Mr. Sterling's hands. They rested lightly on the armrest of his chair. They were large hands. Strong, with clean, manicured nails. They were the hands of a man who commanded, who didn't do physical work. I watched as he gestured while talking. A quick, sweeping motion of control. There was a small, almost imperceptible scar, a thin, white line across the back of his right hand. My heart gave a sharp, painful lurch. It was a scar I remembered. A childhood burn, caused by hot oil, a scar my late husband had pointed out to me in a dusty photograph 30 years ago. He was there, Ellie. I saw him running away from the scene. The realization was silent, a cold, heavy weight settling in my chest. The central air conditioning hummed, a persistent, low noise, trying to pretend the world outside didn't exist. I lifted my water glass to my lips. My hand was steady. Too steady. I had come here to confirm a suspicion, a faint, agonizing possibility. I had come with a disguise. Now, I had the truth. A small, ugly mark on a powerful man's hand. The act wasn't just necessary anymore. It was vital. My simple, naive disguise was now my only protection. They would never suspect that the woman sitting quietly on their sofa, sipping filtered water, had just recognized the shadow from her deepest past. I lowered the glass gently, the faint clink of the crystal loud in the silence. I smiled meekly. The smile didn't reach my eyes. The conversation continued around me, a distant, pleasant hum of city life. I didn't hear the specific words anymore. I was only aware of the light, the coldness, the scent of lilies, and the chilling presence of Mr. Sterling's hand. I was no longer in the apartment. I was back in the moment Ethan had been born, holding him close, making a silent promise I never spoke aloud. The promise of reckoning. I looked up, meeting Mrs. Sterling's eye for the first time. Her expression was expectant, waiting for me to say something simple, something grateful. I kept my face bland, passive. But something in my eyes must have slipped through. A flicker of cold, hard recognition. Her polite smile wavered, just for a moment. A tiny, almost invisible crack in her perfect composure. She looked away quickly, turning to speak to Chloe. The moment passed. But I had seen it. The city lights outside the panoramic window began to turn on, one by one, 1,000 small, cold diamonds against the twilight blue. They were bright, glaring, and cold, exactly as they had looked from the bus. I was here now. A ghost in their well-built future. And I knew I couldn't leave yet. I needed to see what else they were hiding behind the polished, expensive silence. I need to know how deep the deception ran. Plate glass and stillness. The air inside the apartment was cold. Not just cool, but deliberately cold, like the temperature of a locked vault. I paused just inside the doorway. The scent hit me first, not a home smell, but a neutral scent. Lilies and filtered air. No dust, no cooking, no trace of human mess. The floor was polished wood that seemed to swallow the light. Every object felt placed, measured. This wasn't a place for living. It was a place for display. I took a quiet breath, reminding myself of the role. I needed to look like I was struggling to understand the sheer size and expense of it all. My shoulders lifted slightly, a small, involuntary gesture of shrinking. A woman moved towards me from the center of the vast living space. Mrs. Vivian Sterling. She was immaculate. Everything about her was smoothed, tailored. Her movements were graceful, contained. She offered her hand. I took it. Her skin was incredibly soft, like the petal of a rose I'd never dared to touch. It was a softness that came from never having done hard work. My own hand, rough from years of pulling weeds and mending things, felt alien against hers. "Welcome, Eleanor," she said. Her voice was perfectly pitched, polite, but it held a distant, almost practiced quality. She smiled. The smile was beautiful, but it didn't quite reach the careful lines around her eyes. I returned a small, shy nod. I didn't use her name. I didn't want to use their names yet. The sheer silence of the apartment was unnerving. In my house, there was always the sound of the old refrigerator kicking on, or the distant song of crickets, or the wood settling. Here, there was only the hum of the climate control. A sound of endless, enforced order. Mrs. Sterling led me further into the room. I walked slowly, deliberately, letting my eyes linger on things I wouldn't understand. A statue made of clear glass. A painting that looked like spilled paint, but framed in heavy gold. It was too much space for 3 people. It felt lonely, an enormous echoing chamber of wealth. Then I saw Mr. Marcus Sterling. He was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, near a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He didn't rise immediately. He finished whatever he was looking at on his tablet, set it down with a soft click, and then stood. A slow, measured action of a man who makes others wait. He was tall, solid. His suit looked expensive, molded to his frame. He exuded a stillness that felt less like peace and more like control. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. The look was quick, clinical. He was assessing the value of the woman standing before him. I felt the appraisal. I knew exactly what he saw: faded cotton, worn shoes, slightly stooped posture. A non-threat. He didn't offer his hand. He simply inclined his head slightly. "Eleanor," he acknowledged. His voice was a low rumble, the kind that expects to be listened to. I kept my gaze low, looking past him to the skyline outside. I offered a simple, quiet greeting, too soft to be heard clearly over the gentle hum of the air. He immediately turned his attention back to Ethan, who had just come out of the kitchen, looking a bit flustered. "Ethan. Glad you made it." "Vivian, tell Eleanor how much we appreciate her coming all this way." He addressed his wife, but the message was for me. A reminder of the distance I had traveled, the inconvenience I represented. Mrs. Sterling smoothly picked up the thread. "Yes, we are so touched. We just want you to be comfortable while you're here." Comfortable. The word felt brittle, like the glass sculpture near the door. I finally allowed my eyes to meet Mr. Sterling's for a brief second. There was nothing hostile in them, only absolute, quiet certainty. The certainty of a person who has never had to doubt his position. It was this certainty I needed them to maintain. If they thought I was simple, they wouldn't guard their edges. I found my place on the edge of a massive, white sofa. It was plush, too deep. I sat carefully, only allowing my weight to touch the very edge, as if I might spoil the fabric. I was the foreign object here. A quiet, dusty piece of the past in their perfectly arranged present. Mrs. Sterling offered water. Not tap water, but bottled water, cold and perfectly clear. I accepted it with another small, grateful nod, holding the glass carefully in both hands. The conversation that followed was not with me, but around me. Mr. Sterling spoke mostly to Ethan, detailing the itinerary for the wedding planning, mentioning the cost of the venue, the importance of the guest list. He spoke about finance and business, a language I barely understood, terms that were meant to impress and exclude. "It's about stability, Ethan," he said, leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the armrests of his chair. "Sterling and Associates doesn't just manage assets, we manage futures." "Your future?" Ethan nodded eagerly, absorbed. He saw opportunity. I saw a cage. I watched Mr. Sterling's hands as he spoke. They were large, capable hands, but smooth. The hands of a strategist, not a laborer. He tapped the armrest lightly to emphasize a point about a market trend. The movement was fast, controlled, a flick of the wrist. I focused on the back of his right hand. The overhead lighting was bright, unforgiving, catching every surface detail. There it was. A small, faint line. Not a wrinkle, not a shadow. It was a scar. A thin, white, vertical line, maybe an inch long, visible right across the prominent vein on the back of his hand. It was almost invisible, hidden by the size of his hand and the casual way he held it. But I had seen enough scars in my life to know one. I felt a sudden, sharp, internal jolt. My breathing hitched, a small catch in my throat. I lifted the glass of water slowly, deliberately, taking a sip to cover the sudden tremor that threatened to run through me. I forced my eyes away from the scar, looking instead at the complex, abstract painting on the wall behind him. I needed to reset my focus. But the image of the scar remained, burned into my memory. My mind went back 30 years. To a small, water-stained photograph my husband, James, had carried. A photo from his brief military days, of a small group of men. James had circled one man's face in faint pencil. And he had pointed out a distinctive burn mark on the back of that man's hand in the photo. "That man, Ellie," James had said, his voice quiet, heavy. He was there. He knew what happened. James had never been able to prove anything. He had only this photo, and the quiet knowledge that he was being followed, being watched. I looked at Mr. Marcus Sterling again. The powerful CEO. The respectable father. The future father-in-law. And the scar. The match was too precise, too horrifying to be a coincidence. The certainty that had filled the room shifted. It became the silence before a terrible storm. I had come here with a suspicion, a ghost of a possibility. Now, I had a name and a mark. I set the water glass down slowly, gently, so it made no sound. My whole body felt cold, colder than the air conditioning. I had to continue the act. I had to let them believe I was just the simple mother, awed by their wealth. I had to let them be careless. Mrs. Sterling was speaking about her nonprofit work, her voice a calm, even flow. I forced myself to respond, using the simplest words I could manage. "That sounds very good," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Sterling looked at me, a flicker of something like mild surprise that I had actually contributed. He dismissed my response with a tiny, indulgent smile that did not change the calculation in his eyes. He then shifted the conversation to the family's upcoming sailing trip, a lavish display of their freedom and leisure. I listened, but my mind was moving quickly, silently, connecting threads. The power, the business, the military background suggested by the photo, the scar, the timing of James's death. It all fit into a narrative of quiet violence covered by immense resources. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It was a rhythm of fear, but also a rhythm of resolve. I realized the true danger was not that they would discover my past, but that Ethan was completely entangled with their present. He was walking directly into their web. I needed to extract information, not confront. Not yet. I glanced at Mrs. Sterling. She was watching me again, but this time her curiosity felt different. It was edged with a tiny amount of unease. Had she noticed the abrupt stillness in my body? Had she sensed the moment my internal landscape shattered? I immediately dropped my gaze to my hands resting in my lap, smoothing the creases of my old dress. I deliberately let my shoulders slump a bit more, emphasizing my weariness. I had to look tired. Tired and out of place. Mrs. Sterling seemed satisfied with the visual cue. She reached over and lightly patted my arm. "Poor thing. I'm sure you're exhausted, Eleanor. We should let you rest." Her tone was patronizing, but meant to be kind. It was a dismissal. A quiet, polite ejection from the central stage. I stood up slowly, deliberately, not looking at Mr. Sterling again. I didn't want him to see the cold clarity that had replaced my awe. I managed a soft, "Thank you. It's a very grand place." I used the word grand instead of beautiful. Grand speaks of size and scale, not soul. Mr. Sterling simply nodded, already picking up his tablet. He had dismissed me as quickly as a minor detail on a balance sheet. Mrs. Sterling walked me to a guest suite that was almost as large as my entire house. It was decorated in soft grays and blues, designed for maximum, luxurious anonymity. She showed me the pristine bathroom, the thick towels, the silence. "If you need anything at all, just call the intercom," she instructed, her voice soft. I nodded. "You are very kind." It was another lie. I knew she wasn't being kind, she was being efficient. Tucking me away where I wouldn't disrupt the perfect aesthetic. She closed the door behind her with a soft click. I stood alone in the center of the room. The silence rushed in, enormous and empty. I walked to the window. The city lights were spectacular from this height, stretching out like a glittering, endless net. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. The heat of my skin left a faint fog on the sterile surface. I wasn't tired anymore. The shock had replaced all fatigue with a cold, clear energy. I looked down at the palm of my hand. It was trembling now, a fine, barely perceptible shake. I remembered the scar. The scar that linked this powerful man to the ghost of my husband. I knew I was standing in the home of the man who had taken James from me. And my son was planning to marry his daughter. I walked to the bed, but I didn't lie down. I sat on the edge of the plush mattress, rigid and awake. The stillness of the apartment was no longer just silence. It felt like a deep, hidden vault. And somewhere in that vault, I knew there was more than just a scar. There was proof. The sun had completely set. The city was a sea of cold, brilliant light. I was no longer the simple mother. I was a detective, fueled by 30 years of grief. I just had to figure out where the key was hidden. The marble dining table. The table was made of white marble. It was enormous. It reflected the light of the modern chandelier above, throwing back a sterile, blinding glare. It felt less like a surface for eating and more like a mausoleum. Cold, solid, permanent. I was placed directly across from Mr. Marcus Sterling. The distance between us, across the expanse of the table, felt measured, deliberate. I sat very straight in the heavy dining chair. I barely reached the surface of the table. Mrs. Sterling was at the far end, overseeing the maid who quietly placed plates down. The food was beautiful. Intricate. Small portions of things I couldn't name, arranged like tiny sculptures. I hadn't eaten much since leaving home. The journey had tied my stomach in a knot. Now, fear had taken away my appetite entirely. I picked up my fork. The silver felt heavy, cold, unforgiving in my hand. The meal began in a rush of politeness that quickly dissolved into a one-sided conversation. Mr. Sterling talked. Not to me, or even really to his wife or daughter, but to Ethan. He spoke of the firm, of his legacy. He spoke in percentages and valuations, his voice a steady, low drone of quiet authority. The market always respects stability, Ethan, he stated, cutting his steak with precise movements. Sentiment is weak, data is strong. That's the foundation of everything we build here. Ethan listened intently, nodding. He looked happy, hopeful. He was soaking up the ambition and the confidence that filled the room. I watched my son. He was so ready to belong here. This made my task feel heavier, more brutal. I ate sparingly. A bite of plain rice, a small piece of roasted vegetable. I avoided the rich sauces and complex flavors. It was part of the act. The country woman only eats simple things. But mostly, it was a practical necessity. I couldn't risk my stomach failing me now. I focused on serving Ethan. I would reach across the center floral arrangement and place a piece of chicken or a vegetable on his plate. It was a quiet, almost invisible ritual of motherhood. A way to tell him, I am still here. I am still yours. Mr. Sterling ignored these small, familial gestures completely. He treated me as a piece of quiet furniture, an unavoidable necessity. This was exactly what I had hoped for. Condescension breeds blindness. Mrs. Sterling, on the other hand, watched. Not me, but my behavior. She seemed to be subtly cataloging my simple manners, my quiet refusal of the wine. A mental checklist. Her scrutiny was unnerving, but predictable. She was safeguarding her perfect world. I needed to break her gaze, to focus on the one person who carried the physical sign of the past. I turned my attention back to Mr. Sterling. The light from the chandelier was strong, catching the high polish of his silverware and the edges of his dark jacket. I kept my gaze fixed, not on his face, but on his hands. Mr. Sterling reached for his water glass. He spoke a sentence about a merger that would impact the entire eastern seaboard. He was proud of the scale. He paused his narrative only when he gestured to the maid. He gave a quiet, low-voiced instruction about the temperature of the room. It was a small action of command, the simple assumption that his comfort superseded all others. As he gestured, his right hand moved quickly, dismissively, towards the edge of the table. And there it was. The light caught it perfectly. The thin, white line across the back of his hand. It was barely a centimeter long, a thread of pale, dead skin. It looked old, healed thoroughly, yet still distinct against the tan of his skin. I felt the blood drain from my face. A cold rush, like water pouring into an empty basin. The air conditioning hummed. The silverware clinked softly as Ethan ate. The sounds felt distant, muffled. I couldn't move. My hand, resting beside my plate, clenched into a fist, crushing the napkin beneath my palm. The scar. It was the same one James had shown me in the faded photograph, the one he had gotten from a steam burn when he was a boy working in the shipyards. A distinctive, ugly little mark. I had dismissed it for years as a phantom memory, a painful coincidence, a piece of grief taking shape. But seeing it now, real, raised, and white against the powerful hand of Marcus Sterling, was a physical shock. It was confirmation. Hard, cold, marble-like confirmation. He was the one. The man James had spent the last 2 years of his life trying to expose. The man James said was too high up, too untouchable. My vision blurred slightly, focusing only on that thin white line. I forced myself to breathe. Slow. Shallow. The way I had learned to breathe 30 years ago, after the doctor delivered the official, final verdict on the accident. I looked up at Mr. Sterling's face. He was smiling now, a small, satisfied smirk as he concluded his point to Ethan. He smiled, but not with his eyes. His eyes were cold, assessing, already moving on to the next subject. He had no idea that the silent, simple woman across the table had just recognized a secret he thought was buried forever. I reached for my water, my hand trembling slightly. I steadied it against the glass, letting the cold seep into my palm. I had to maintain the simple gaze. The look of being overwhelmed by the wealth and the language. I had to be careful. One wrong word, one wrong look, and the entire edifice of my protection, my access, would crumble. Mrs. Sterling noticed my hesitation with the water glass. "Are you quite all right, Eleanor? You look a bit pale." Her voice held a note of genuine concern, mixed with professional annoyance at a flaw in her perfect tableau. I met her gaze. My eyes felt wide, but I forced the expression to be one of simple fatigue. "Just the long journey, Mrs. Sterling," I whispered. "The city air is so different. It makes my head spin." A slight smile touched Mrs. Sterling's lips. A smile of superior understanding. She accepted the excuse. It fit the narrative of the simple visitor. "Of course," she said, and signaled the maid. "Get Eleanor a warm, calming tea, please. She needs to settle." Mr. Sterling waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense, Vivian. She's fine. Ethan, let's discuss the matter of your prenuptial agreement tomorrow morning. We need to protect the assets." He used the word assets with a reverence that chilled me. Everything, I realized, was an asset to him. Even his daughter's marriage. His hand, the one with the scar, moved again as he stacked his silverware neatly on the plate. The scar disappeared into the shadow of his thumb. I knew then that the act wasn't just a protective measure for me, it was the key to their arrogance. They were so certain of their invulnerability, their superiority, that they couldn't conceive of danger coming from someone so small, so quiet, so poorly dressed. This arrogance was my shield. I took a deep, silent inventory of the room. The coldness. The marble. The silence. The expensive, untroubled air. They were hiding the truth in plain sight, protected by their class and their confidence. My grief, which had been a dull, constant ache for decades, suddenly sharpened into a single, crystalline point of purpose. The pain was no longer just pain. It was a fuel. I looked at Ethan. He was defending Chloe's insistence on a smaller wedding, a gesture of his love for her. His goodness. I had to be here. I had to know everything before I acted. For James. For Ethan. I picked up my fork again, deliberately placing a piece of food on my plate. I took a bite. It tasted like ash, but I chewed it slowly. I needed strength. I needed to finish the meal. I needed to see more. I needed to see where the scar led. The dessert was served. Something light, covered in spun sugar. I declined it gently, citing my simple stomach. Mr. Sterling pushed back from the table. The scrape of his chair on the marble floor was a sharp, grating sound, the loudest noise yet in the room. The tension broke. The meal was over. He offered a brusque farewell, already checking the time on his watch. He had a late-night call with Asia. Business. Good night, Eleanor, he said, his voice flat. He didn't wait for a reply. He walked quickly out of the dining room, his expensive shoes making no sound on the wood. As he left, I looked at his right hand one last time. It was the last image I needed to carry with me into the night. The thin, white scar. A ribbon of evidence against a mountain of denial. Mrs. Sterling offered a polite plan for the next morning, brunch, followed by a shopping trip for Chloe. She wanted me occupied. I agreed to everything, my voice soft and acquiescent. I stood up from the cold table. The chair felt heavy as I pushed it back. I was no longer just the mother who missed her bus. I was a witness. I was in their house. And they hadn't seen me yet. I turned away from the cold marble and the quiet perfection. I followed Mrs. Sterling out of the room. The only question now was what else they had left exposed. Chloe's quiet despair. The air in the living room felt heavier after Mr. Sterling left. Like a door closing on a pressure chamber. Chloe approached me. She carried a small tea service, the delicate porcelain clinking softly. Auntie Eleanor, come on. Let me show you the rest of the place. It's too much house, really, but my father likes things to be impressive. Her voice was low, almost confidential, a sudden break from the family's controlled formality. It was the first honest sound I'd heard since arriving. I stood up slowly. My legs felt stiff, weighted down by the realization of the scar. I nodded, offering a small, grateful smile. This was my next window. A chance to see beyond the marble. We began walking. The tour was hushed, reverent. Chloe showed me the sleek, minimalist kitchen. Everything was hidden behind smooth panels. No dishes in sight, no evidence of actual cooking. My mother insists on order, Chloe murmured, opening a cabinet to reveal perfectly stacked white plates. Nothing can be out of place. I thought of my own kitchen, the spice jars clustered by the stove, the worn wooden spoons, the faint smell of bread. Life. It is very clean, I replied, choosing my words carefully. Cleanliness felt like a disguise here. She paused, looking out a large window at the city sprawling below. Her profile was beautiful, delicate. But there was a persistent shadow under her eyes. It's the quiet that gets to me sometimes, she confessed, her voice barely audible. It's a different kind of quiet than what you have in the country, isn't it? Heavy. I understood. The country quiet is full of sound, wind, insects, rustling leaves. This quiet was the absence of sound. The silence of things being locked away. I looked at Chloe. She wasn't judging me, she was confiding in me. A quiet plea for kinship. I kept my face passive, but I let my eyes soften slightly, allowing a flicker of genuine sympathy to show through. You miss the noise of life, I suggested gently. She turned back to me, and her expression was instantly unguarded. Yes. I miss mess. She seemed lost here, like a vibrant, wild flower planted in a porcelain vase. She was longing for the earth. I knew, suddenly and certainly, that her distress was real. She wasn't complicit in her father's power, she was a casualty of it. This made my plan harder. I couldn't hate her. But I still had to expose him. We moved into a hallway lined with photographs. Not the usual family snapshots, but large, professional portraits. All smiling, polished faces. Chloe stopped at a display near a bookcase. This is the library, or what Dad calls the study, she explained. It's the quietest room. She leaned against the wall, her energy draining slightly. I sometimes come here just to sit. It's the only place my mother doesn't try to decorate. Dad won't let anyone touch his books or his things. Her hand brushed against a small, intricate carving on the wooden frame of the bookcase. He is very protective of the past, she added, her voice dropping lower. I let my eyes scan the shelves. Leather-bound books, dense and heavy. Statuettes. A display of commemorative medals. I was searching for the faded photo I had glimpsed earlier, the one with the military uniform. It wasn't visible here. My gaze returned to Chloe. I needed her to talk about the past. Not mine, but theirs. It must be hard, I said quietly, deliberately focusing on her emotional state. Living up here. So far from everything. She hesitated, then sighed deeply. It's always been about appearances. About being unflappable. She looked down at her hands, turning a simple silver ring around her finger. There was this time, years ago. Right after the accident. The word hit me like a physical blow. Accident. The word they had used for James's death. The word that had been accepted by the courts. I froze. I didn't move my face, didn't shift my weight. I just held my breath, waiting. The whole family was supposed to go to the coast. Dad had chartered a big yacht. And then it was cancelled. Everything was cancelled. They just said there was a business inconvenience. Her voice was flat, recounting an old wound. But the house went cold. Literally cold. My parents didn't speak for weeks. My dad, he just went into that study and didn't come out. The silence felt sick. She shuddered slightly. I was young, but I knew. It wasn't a business inconvenience. It was something awful. Something they had to clean up. She looked up at me, her eyes clouded with old pain. She wasn't looking for sympathy, she was looking for a witness to her own buried knowledge. It changed them. My mother started obsessing over order and surface beauty. My dad became even more untouchable. She trailed off, leaving the unspoken truth hanging in the controlled, sterile air. I maintained the quiet simplicity of the country mother. I allowed my expression to be one of gentle bewilderment, as if the complexities of the city were simply too much. But inside, the memory was a sudden, roaring wave. The accident. The sudden, forced silence. The cleanup. It was the mirror image of my own experience, only seen from the other side of the glass. The side of the guilty. I took a small step closer to the bookcase, allowing the quiet proximity to encourage her. Your father seems like a man who fixes things, I offered softly. Chloe laughed, a short, brittle sound that held no joy. He doesn't fix things, Eleanor. He erases them. Her voice was sharper now, laced with resentment. This was the raw, genuine anger of a daughter who knows her parents have a dark past. The incident, the accident, it involved a lot of money, I think. Or something very valuable. They never said. But I remember hearing them argue about a report that had to be filed correctly. That was the code for made to disappear. I felt a tremor run through my hands. A report. A file. Something written down. I slowly moved my hand to the wall near the study door, resting my palm against the smooth, cold wood. It helped ground me. It must have been frightening, being so young when all that happened, I whispered. She shrugged, moving away from the bookcase. It was just life with the Sterlings. We live in a clean house, but the foundation is muddy. She stopped, suddenly realizing how much she had revealed. Her face changed instantly, the protective mask slamming back into place. I shouldn't bore you with all this, she said, her voice turning brisk, polite again. You're here for a wedding, not a therapy session. The shift was jarring. She was pulling the curtain back down. The moment of confession was over. I didn't mean to pry, I said, gently reinforcing my role as the passive observer. I just worry about Ethan. I want him to be happy. Chloe's expression softened again, but only slightly. He will be happy. That's why I chose him. He's real. He doesn't know how to lie about the small things. Her implication was clear. Everyone else in her life, especially her parents, knew how to lie about the big things. I looked back at the study door. Marcus Sterling was protecting his past, his secrets, and the reports in that quiet room. And Chloe had just pointed me to the entrance. The chilling connection between my husband's accident and their incident was no longer a theory. It was an established geographical link. It had happened at the same time, with the same result. A powerful man covered it up with silence. I knew now that the real evidence wouldn't be in a public space. It would be locked away, tucked into the one room where Mr. Sterling felt most secure. The study. Chloe led me back toward the elevator, her hand resting lightly on the wall as she walked. We should get some rest, she said. Tomorrow is a long day. My mother has planned a private viewing at the jewelry district. A distraction. A distraction. That was precisely what I needed them to think I was. As we waited for the elevator, I looked back at the hallway, at the heavy, dark wood door of the study. The cold air conditioning felt like it was blowing right through me, but I didn't shiver. I was perfectly, icily calm. You are a very thoughtful girl, Chloe, I said softly. You just want peace. She looked at me, a flash of genuine, weary gratitude in her eyes. I just want the truth to be uncomplicated, Eleanor. Like the country. The elevator arrived. The doors slid open with a soft sigh. We stepped into the small, confined space. The descent was quiet, isolating. I looked at my reflection in the polished brass of the elevator door. I looked exactly as I intended, a simple, tired woman, thinking only of her son's happiness. But the woman looking back was thinking only of the scar, the report, and the mud beneath the foundation of this towering, perfect home. I knew where I had to go next. I just had to wait for the quietest time of night. The faded corner photo. The house had settled into its nighttime rhythm. A deep, manufactured quiet. I lay on the soft, expensive sheets of the guest bed, but I couldn't sleep. The cold realization of the scar on Mr. Sterling's hand was a physical presence in the room. Around midnight, I heard the subtle click of a heavy door closing far down the hall. Mr. Sterling, finishing his call to Asia. I waited another 30 minutes. The sound of the city outside was muted, just a constant, distant shush. When I finally stood, the silence felt immense, watching. I moved slowly, silently, like smoke. My bare feet made no sound on the thick carpet. The hallway was dimly lit by recessed lights, creating long, deliberate shadows. Everything in this apartment was designed to hide. I wasn't looking for the study yet. That door was too close to the master suite. I was looking for the corner, the place where memories went to be displayed, but not truly seen. I moved past the expansive living room, its white furniture ghostly in the low light. I walked toward the side corridor, where Chloe had pointed out the library. There, tucked between two massive abstract paintings, was a stretch of wall lined with built-in shelves. And among the perfectly aligned books and heavy ceramic objects, were a few small, framed photos. Personal history reduced to decorative elements. I stopped before the shelf. I pretended to adjust a cuff on my borrowed pajama sleeve. The air here was cooler than the bedroom. Stagnant. I felt a sudden rush of fear, cold and metallic in my throat. This was the most vulnerable part of the house, the personal space. But the fear was quickly replaced by the fierce, cold logic of necessity. I was looking for a pattern. The scar was the first piece. Now I needed the context. I began to look at the photos. Most were recent, Chloe graduating, the family posing at some sunny, unnamed resort. All bright smiles, no substance. Then, my eyes landed on the target. It was a small, square frame, pushed slightly back into a dark recess of the shelf, next to a heavy bronze bust. The light barely touched it. It looked old. Faded. I reached out my hand. My fingers brushed the cool glass of the frame. I lifted it gently. It weighed almost nothing. I brought it closer to the nearest dim light source, tilting it just so. The photo was a group shot of 6 young men. They were standing in front of a low, nondescript building that looked vaguely military or perhaps industrial. The grass was dry. The men wore uniforms. Old, heavy-looking fabric, not the polished dress uniforms of ceremony, but work or field gear. In the center, looking young, lean, and utterly ruthless, was Marcus Sterling. His gaze in the photo was the same as it was now assessing, impatient. My heart began its slow, heavy thudding again. A muffled drumbeat in the enormous silence. I turned my focus to the man standing right beside him. A shorter man, with intense, close-set eyes. He wasn't smiling. None of them were. On the chest pocket of the shorter man's uniform, pinned above a row of faded ribbons, was a small, metallic badge. It wasn't a standard U.S. military insignia that I recognized from James's old papers. It was complex. A stylized globe maybe, overlaid with an arrow or a thin, vertical spear. It looked like the symbol of a specialized unit, perhaps an intelligence or logistical operation. Something that works in the shadows. I brought the photo closer, squinting in the low light. I felt the paper of the photograph brittle and thin. The picture itself was mottled with age. I had to memorize the badge. Every curve, every small detail. I closed my eyes, trying to burn the image onto my mind. The globe. The spear. The way it was pinned slightly crooked. I repeated the details silently, a new, sharp, and terrible mantra. This image wasn't pride. It was a trophy. A relic of the person Mr. Sterling used to be. I felt a cold sense of absolute clarity. James had told me, years ago, that the men involved in the shipping company accident had deep ties to a private security or logistics firm that acted outside the traditional military chain. That badge, it could be the proof of that connection. The tangible link between the soldier and the CEO. Between the past and the present. The truth was literally hanging on their wall, framed by their overconfidence that no one would ever know what it meant. They hadn't even bothered to remove it. They just tucked it out of the direct glare. I carefully placed the photo back on the shelf, pushing it into the shadow where I had found it. My hands were shaking lightly now, the tremor undeniable. I put my hands behind my back, pressing them against the cool wall to steady them. I looked around the enormous, quiet room. The books here were sealed behind glass doors. Unreadable. Unused. I moved toward the study door. It was heavier than the others, dark mahogany, blending into the wall paneling. It didn't look like a typical home office door. It looked like the entrance to a vault. I reached out and laid my palm flat against the wood. It was smooth, cold, silent. Behind this door was where Mr. Sterling had retreated after the accident, according to Chloe. Behind this door was where he managed his assets, made his deals, and controlled his narrative. And behind this door was likely the report Chloe had mentioned. The record of the incident that had been filed correctly. I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath. I could hear nothing. Not a whirring computer, not a faint voice. Just the dead air inside the wall. It felt impenetrable. The lock was hidden, no obvious keyhole or handle. It was likely electronic, requiring a code or a fob. Something beyond my simple mother disguise. I stepped back, my shadow long and thin on the polished floor. I had come this far. I had confirmed the man and the context. But I needed the paper. The hard evidence. I couldn't risk trying to force the lock. I had to wait for an opportunity. I had to maintain my invisibility. I looked back at the small, faded photograph. It was a tiny light in the darkness. It felt like a beacon, a challenge James had left for me. The connection was undeniable now. The man who destroyed my life was the man who was about to become family. I closed my eyes, letting the full weight of the discovery settle. It was a terrible, immense pressure. But it wasn't paralyzing. It was clarifying. I had to get into that study. I had to find what he had erased. I returned to the guest room just as quietly as I had left. The clock on the bedside table read 1:45 a.m. The deepest, most secret part of the night. I sat back on the edge of the bed. I didn't get under the sheets. I pressed my fingers into my eyelids, trying to recall the exact shape of the badge. The globe. The spear. I repeated it over and over, engraving the symbol onto my memory. I looked out the window at the distant city lights. They no longer felt cold and distant. They felt like a map, spread out before me. I was no longer just waiting. I was planning. The silence of the room was different now. It wasn't the silence of peace, or the silence of order. It was the silence of a hunter waiting for the right moment. I lay down slowly, keeping my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling where the shadows played. The knowledge I now held the scar, the badge was heavier than the marble table. I knew I couldn't search the internet for the badge's meaning in this house. The Sterlings would track the activity immediately. I would have to wait. But I had the image. And I had the door. I was the simple mother from the quiet countryside, but I was carrying a secret that could collapse the Sterling Empire. And I knew my next move had to be outside the home. I needed an unseen moment in the world. I needed to find out what that spear and globe truly meant. The guest room was dark. The city lights were too far below to truly illuminate the space, leaving it in a suspended twilight. I sat at the small writing desk, the heavy leather chair cold beneath my thighs. The knowledge of the scar and the badge was a physical weight now. It pressed down on my chest, demanding action. I took the phone, my old, simple cell phone, the kind that doesn't track things. I looked at Ethan's name on the screen. He wouldn't be asleep. He'd be worried. I had to call him. But I couldn't just reassure him. I had to warn him. I walked toward the window, pulling the thin, sheer curtain aside. The city was a sprawling tapestry of cold white and yellow lights. Distant, indifferent. I needed to speak to Ethan without any possibility of being overheard. I knew the Sterlings would have multiple layers of security, but I counted on their arrogance to ignore the simple cell signal of a woman they deemed insignificant. I paced the length of the window once, twice. The thick carpet absorbed all sound. I dialed his number. My thumb felt clumsy on the keys. It rang only once. Ethan answered immediately, his voice sharp with relief. Mom? Thank God. I've been calling. Are you okay? Did they treat you all right? His concern was real. It was the only thing that felt real in this whole glass tower. I'm fine, son, I said. I tried to keep my voice low, even. But the tension stretched the sound thin. They are, very correct. Very formal. I'm sorry, Mom. I know it's a lot. They're just used to a certain level of living. He was apologizing for them. Protecting their image. I closed my eyes. I had to stop him. Ethan, listen to me. Closely. My abruptness startled him. The sudden shift in tone was palpable through the line. What is it, Mom? Is something wrong? Nothing is wrong here. But I need you to do something for me. Something very important. And you cannot, under any circumstances, mention it to Chloe. Or her parents. The word cannot was firm, a small, hard stone dropped between us. He went quiet. The sound of his own apartment, the faint music, the hum of his own city life disappeared. He knew my serious voice. The voice I hadn't used since he was 10, and I told him his father wouldn't be coming home. I need you to tell me exactly what you've told them about your father, I instructed. My voice was barely a whisper now, forced low. It felt like speaking through concrete. There was a long pause on his end. The kind of pause that signals retrieval and confusion. What? Nothing much, Mom. Just the basics. That he passed away in an accident years ago. That he worked in logistics, shipping. You know, container coordination. That he loved the sea. He was reciting the carefully edited story we had maintained for years. The sanitized version. Did you mention the specific company? The name of his employer? The final project he was working on? No, Mom. Why would I? That was forever ago. I just said he worked for a small independent firm. Why are you asking all this? His confusion was a small shield. I had to maintain it. You mustn't tell them anything more, I pressed. Nothing about the firm. Nothing about his military service. Absolutely nothing about the nature of the accident itself. I moved my hand to the glass windowpane, placing my palm flat against the cold surface. The sensation anchored me. Did you mention the report? The internal investigation the firm conducted? The what? No, Mom, there was no report. The police ruled it a mechanical failure almost immediately. We never talked about any investigation. What are you talking about? His genuine bewilderment was reassuring. He hadn't compromised the silence. Good, I breathed out. That is good. You must remember this, Ethan. You are a simple boy from the country. Your father was a simple man. No details. No complexity. I was reinforcing the exact facade I was using. I needed him to play his role, too, unknowingly. But why the sudden secrecy, Mom? They're my fiancé's parents. We're getting married. His voice was strained now, laced with hurt. He felt the coldness of my instruction, the lack of trust. It's about them, Ethan. Not about us, I explained, choosing my words with painful precision. They are very powerful. They are very cautious. Sometimes when people are so high up, they view any uncertainty as a risk. And they treat risks harshly. I didn't explain the scar. I didn't explain the badge. I just planted the seed of fear. I want you to be absolutely boring when you talk about your past. Do you understand? No details that can be checked. No names that can be traced. I waited. The silence was long this time, full of his sudden doubt. I understand, Mom. But I don't like it. I know, son. But you have to trust me on this. For now, it's about protection. I heard a small, muffled sound outside my door. A light, faint shift of weight on the carpet. I froze. My breath locked in my chest. Had someone heard? Was it Mrs. Sterling, checking on the quiet guest? Or Mr. Sterling, returning from his study? I lowered my voice to a barely audible whisper, leaning closer to the phone. I have to go now, Ethan. But promise me. No more stories. No more details. Be the simple country boy they expect you to be. I promise, Mom. But you need to call me tomorrow. And tell me what this is really about. His demand was fair. But I couldn't grant it. Not until I had the paper. I will, I promised, knowing it was another lie. I will tell you everything when I can. Just keep smiling, Ethan. Keep her happy. I hung up quickly, without a proper goodbye. The abruptness felt cruel, but necessary. I held the phone tightly, waiting. The silence outside the door continued. I heard nothing more. The sound I had heard could have been the building settling, or the heavy fabric of a curtain moving. But the fear lingered, sharp and acrid. I walked silently to the door and pressed my ear to the cold wood. Nothing. Only the hum of the air conditioning. I walked backward slowly, away from the door and into the center of the room. My focus sharpened to a single, cold point. They were listening. Not necessarily to the call, but they were listening to the entire apartment. They were cautious. This meant I had to move faster. My presence here was already a known variable, a potential instability. If they were listening, my simple disguise wouldn't hold forever. My composure, my quiet observations, would eventually be seen for what they were, surveillance. I looked out at the city lights again. The badge. The scar. The threat to Ethan. The worst realization settled over me. If they were capable of causing James's accident to protect their empire, they were capable of using Ethan as leverage against me if they learned what I knew. I had to protect my son from their suspicion now, and from their retaliation later. The quiet, defensive instructions I had given him were no longer enough. I needed offensive intelligence. I needed the paper. The report that explained the scar and the badge. I knew exactly where it was. Behind the thick, dark door of the study. I placed the phone on the bedside table. It looked small and dull next to the imported lamp. I walked to the dresser and opened my small, worn canvas bag. I took out a thin handkerchief, a piece of linen James had carried. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the fabric, letting the familiar scent of home, faint but real, ground me. I looked at my hands in the dim light. They were steady now. The fear had crystallized into action. The simple mother had just lied to her son to save him. I thought about the dark study, silent and closed off from the rest of the bright, cold apartment. I thought about the electronic lock. They had underestimated me. They hadn't locked their past tightly enough. I had to get into that room. I had to find a way to break their silence. I spent the next hour simply observing the light changes in the hallway outside my door, waiting for the first sign of dawn, the first stirrings of the household. I needed a moment of true distraction. A window. The night was long and cold, but I was wide awake. My heart was no longer beating with grief. It was beating with the fierce, cold rhythm of retrieval. I just had to wait for the Sterlings to leave the nest. The morning light in the city was thin, pale. It struggled to reach the apartment, only managing to touch the highest surfaces. I woke before the alarm, the anxiety a cold knot beneath my ribs. I dressed quickly in the same worn clothes. The apartment was still profoundly silent, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of night. It was the careful, managed silence of the early morning. I walked toward the kitchen, feigning a search for coffee, but really, I was looking for a movement, a presence. I found Mrs. Vivian Sterling outside, on a small, glassed-in terrace. Her garden. The terrace was a perfect contrast to the rest of the apartment. It was lush, damp, and smelled of wet earth and meticulously arranged flowers. It was immaculate, too. The soil was rich black, contained in custom stone planters. Not a single leaf lay out of place. It was a garden managed by a surgeon. Mrs. Sterling was there, dressed in crisp white linen, wearing small gardening gloves. She was lightly misting a row of herbs with a silver sprayer. She looked up when she heard my soft approach. Her expression was neutral, polite. Eleanor. Good morning. Did you sleep well? Very well, thank you, I replied, my voice quiet, simple. It is beautiful up here. So much green. I walked toward the planters, my worn sneakers contrasting sharply with the polished stone floor of the terrace. She nodded, turning back to her misting. It's my one indulgence. A bit of order I can impose on nature. She emphasized the word order. It was a quiet manifesto. I stood beside her. I didn't try to touch the plants. They felt too delicate, too curated. You must miss your own garden, she observed, her voice conversational, but the question felt like a fishing line cast into dark water. I do, I admitted simply. But my garden is different. More wild. More useful. She paused the sprayer, finally turning to face me fully. The light caught the perfect setting of her expensive diamond earrings. Useful? How so? She was inviting me to talk about my life. To give her context she could categorize, assess. I knew the game. I began to tell the rehearsed story. A slow, simple narrative of my life in the country. I spoke of Ethan, how I raised him alone after his father died. How the small farm kept us going. It was hard, of course. But the land is kind. It gives back what you put into it, I said, keeping my tone gentle, reflective, never complaining. I maintained the simple image, the strong, quiet widow, struggling honorably. Mrs. Sterling listened patiently, nodding in the right places. Her eyes, however, were keen. They weren't focused on the emotion of the story, but on the details. And your husband's passing, it was a sudden thing, I recall Ethan mentioning. Her question was casual, yet the delivery was precise. She used Ethan's words as a verification tool. Very sudden, I confirmed, looking out over the immense cityscape. A terrible accident. Just bad luck, really. I chose the words bad luck carefully. It closed the door on further inquiry. He worked, in what capacity? Ethan mentioned something about logistics? She pressed, still seemingly focused on misting a small, bright purple orchid. Yes. Shipping. He helped coordinate things. Large containers, you know. He traveled a lot. It was an honest job. I kept the description deliberately vague. No company names. No locations. Then, I delivered the planned line. The small hook I had prepared to see how she would react to the core truth. He died in a freight accident in the harbor area. A malfunction with the cranes, they said. It was years ago. The insurance company settled quickly. They wanted the matter closed. I paused. I let the word accident hang in the controlled air of the terrace, near the scent of fresh earth. Mrs. Sterling's hand froze. The light sprayer stopped mid-mist. Her head didn't move much, but her eyes snapped up from the orchid and focused directly on my face. The polite facade shattered. The polished surface cracked. Her eyes were suddenly sharp, piercing. Not with sympathy, but with an intense, frozen recognition. The air between us went instantly cold. The hum of the climate control seemed to grow louder, trying to drown out the sudden, terrible silence. She wasn't asking about my story anymore. She was verifying her own. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an hour. She recovered quickly. An instantaneous, practiced mechanism of control snapped back into place. The polite, distant smile returned, but it was thinner now, stretched tightly across her face. Oh, my dear. That is truly awful, she murmured. But her voice was flat, devoid of real warmth. It was a social reflex. She began to mist the orchid again, her movements too jerky, too deliberate. She had seen something. I had struck the target. The word accident or shipping logistics, or perhaps the combination, had resonated with the secret she shared with her husband. I had to maintain my simple role, otherwise she would shut down completely. We managed, I said, my voice quiet, simple, accepting. It taught us to be very careful with what little we had. I used the word careful to subtly imply that I hadn't been careful enough in the past, giving her a sense of superiority. She put the sprayer down on a stone ledge. Her hands, still gloved, fidgeted slightly with the rim of the pot. Accidents are such messy things, she said, her voice dropping. The word messy felt personal, almost hateful. My husband always says that chaos is expensive. You have to remove the uncertainty immediately, or it costs you dearly. She wasn't talking about my husband's death. She was talking about her husband's business philosophy. You sound like you understand that kind of mess, I offered, my gaze innocent, yet fixed on her expression. She looked away, toward the high, pale ceiling. We had our own difficulties, years ago. A complication. Marcus had to clean up a very nasty situation involving an old logistics partner. People don't realize how much liability these operations create. She used the word liability. Not grief. Not loss. She was confirming the linkage. Marcus Sterling was involved in a past logistics cleanup that involved an accident and required immediate, expensive containment. I felt a cold wave of certainty. The scar, the badge in the photo, and now this admission, all pieces fit together. They hadn't just covered up a random accident, they had cleaned up a murder. My own fear subsided, replaced by a terrible, clear coldness. My simple story had worked too well. She had revealed their greatest insecurity. I needed to push once more, but subtly. It sounds like your husband is a very strong man, I said, letting awe creep into my voice. Someone who can handle trouble. She lifted her chin, her eyes softening with pride for her husband's ruthlessness. He is absolute. When he decides something is a threat, it is handled. No loose ends. The phrase "no loose ends" was the final, devastating confirmation. It was a quiet threat aimed not at me, but at the world. Mrs. Sterling suddenly straightened, smoothing the front of her linen tunic. The moment of intimacy, the moment of revelation, was over. Well, I didn't mean to dwell on old, sad stories, Eleanor. Let's talk about the jewelry viewing. I think you'll find the diamond selection very comforting. She was attempting to redirect me toward the distraction she had prepared. I gave her a soft, grateful smile, the best performance I had managed yet. Diamonds, I murmured. That sounds very kind of you. I don't know much about those things. I'm just a simple woman. She accepted the simplicity, the small concession of ignorance, with a visible sigh of relief. The danger, she thought, was past. She turned and began to walk back toward the main apartment, her posture rigid and perfect. I followed her, but I was moving in a different dimension. The whole apartment, the whole city, had changed its meaning. I was no longer just the mother visiting her son. I was a witness in the house of the person who took my husband, and the wife had just quietly admitted to the cover-up. I looked back at the small, immaculate garden. The silence of the terrace was no longer natural. It felt like the silence of a grave, freshly tamped down. Mrs. Sterling opened the heavy glass door. The dry, controlled air of the apartment rushed out. I walked through the doorway, feeling the cold of the marble floor beneath my feet. I had the confirmation. Now, I needed the evidence. I had to find the reports before they realized I had heard the truth. And I knew that the day of distractions would give me exactly the window I needed. The clock on the kitchen wall read 10:15 a.m. The house was empty. A profound, echoing silence had settled again. Mrs. Sterling was gone. She had taken Chloe and Ethan for the distraction, the jewelry viewing. A 2-hour window, at minimum. I was left alone with the silence and the cold, smooth surfaces. I stood by the vast, clean kitchen island, pretending to sip the bitter, expensive coffee Mrs. Sterling had left for me. My worn canvas bag was slung over my shoulder, heavier now with anticipation. I didn't drink the coffee. It was too hot, too strong. It felt like a trap. I looked down the long hallway. The mahogany door of the study was dark, a solid block of wood against the white wall. It was time. The moment was fleeting, fragile. I moved slowly down the hallway. Every step was measured, careful. My simple sneakers made no sound on the polished wood. The air in the hallway was dry, controlled. It felt like the air inside a sealed envelope. I reached the study door. It was cold beneath my fingers. I placed my palm flat against the wood, the subtle texture of the grain pushing back. I examined the lock again. No visible keyhole. Just a smooth, black panel where a fingerprint or a key card would register. I had anticipated this. Absolute security for the absolute truth. But I remembered the maid. The quick, low-voiced instruction Mr. Sterling had given her during dinner, concerning the temperature. He had pressed a small, subtle button on a remote control he kept clipped to his jacket pocket. I checked the small tray near the entrance, where Mrs. Sterling insisted all household remotes be stored. There it was. A sleek, metallic rectangle. It was labeled A/V and had a series of small, unlabeled black buttons. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. I pointed the remote at the door panel, pressing the buttons one by one, slowly, gently. I was looking for a reaction, a light, a sound, anything that suggested an interaction. Click. On the fourth button, a tiny green light blinked on the panel. A soft, electric thud echoed faintly from deep within the heavy door. The lock had disengaged. It wasn't a complex security system. It was a simple magnetic lock, tied to the universal home control system. A system designed for convenience, not conspiracy. They were so focused on the threat from the outside, the corporate enemy, that they never considered the threat of a simple button left on a tray, or the curiosity of a simple woman. I put the remote back on the tray, placing it at the exact angle I had found it. I placed my hand on the cool, unyielding wood of the door and pushed it inward. The door swung open with a sigh. The study was dark, heavy. It smelled of old leather, expensive paper, and cold ambition. The room was furnished not for comfort, but for dominance. A massive, carved desk sat in the center, overlooking the city view. I closed the door silently behind me, leaving the room in a state of deep shadow. I moved immediately to the desk. It was spotless, organized into precise stacks. A minimalist landscape of control. On the corner of the desk, exactly where Chloe had leaned, was the target. The carved wooden box. It was small, about the size of a cigar box, made of heavy, dark oak, intricately carved with abstract, severe patterns. It didn't belong with the modern aesthetic. It was a relic. I reached for it. My hands were perfectly steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a terrible focus. I lifted the box. It was heavy, weighted with something more than just wood. I looked for a lock. There was a tiny, almost invisible clasp on the front. It was metal, tarnished silver. I pressed the clasp. It gave way with a small, quiet click. They hadn't locked it. They had relied on the privacy of the room, the thickness of the door, and the assumption that no one would dare to touch Mr. Sterling's things. The arrogance was monumental. I lifted the lid. The air that rushed out of the box was stale, old, smelling of mildew and forgotten secrets. Inside, there was no jewelry, no sentimental items. Only paper. A stack of yellowed files, bound together with rubber bands that had cracked and dissolved with age. They were thick, official-looking documents. I lifted the entire stack out of the box. I took the top file. It was damp at the edges, slightly water-stained. The header was stamped, in thick, crude red ink, "Internal Investigation, Classified." My heart gave a sharp, hard thump against my ribs. I flipped the cover page. The date was 30 years ago. The exact month James died. The title was terse, Probe of Operational Deficiencies and Material Loss, Project, SEA Wave Logistics. C-Wave Logistics. James's last employer. I scanned the first paragraph, my eyes tearing across the cramped, ancient type. The internal review of the 1995 Q3 container fatality reveals evidence of gross negligence, unauthorized manifest deviations, and probable intentional sabotage tied to the disappearance of high-value cargo, designated Assets 7A and 7B. The fatality, Mr. James Davies, was assigned to audit the manifest discrepancies prior to the incident. I read the name. James Davies. My husband. The name was real. The date was real. The accident wasn't a malfunction. It was sabotage. I felt a quiet, chilling certainty settle over me. It wasn't just Marcus Sterling's scar, it was his intent. He didn't just clean up the mess. He created it. I had to be faster. I put the top file down and went immediately to the third file in the stack. It was thicker, bound with white string. I opened it. This file contained internal memos and handwritten notes. I found a document titled Disposal Authorization, JD. My hands shook, an involuntary tremor of shock and absolute rage. The memo detailed the need to neutralize the source of the audit leak, the individual who knew the contents of the stolen cargo. The initials were JD. And at the bottom of the page, scrawled in thick, black ink, was a signature. M. Sterling. I stared at the name. The name of the man who had sat across from me at the marble dining table, calmly discussing his assets. He didn't just orchestrate the cover-up. He ordered the elimination. My breath caught. It was a low, desperate sound, quickly muffled. I grabbed the entire stack of files and walked quickly to the desk light, turning the small, brass lamp on just a crack. I went through the rest of the files, my eyes racing. One contained a map of the harbor, with a specific crane circled and notes on the failure point. Another contained a cashier's check stub, large, untraceable, marked consulting fee, special services. I found a final sheet, a single, water-stained page, folded small. It was a confidential personnel report from a private logistics and security contractor, the type of firm James had mentioned. The firm's logo was familiar, a globe crossed with a vertical spear. The same badge I had seen in the photograph. The firm was called Argos Maritime Solutions. The truth was an overwhelming, crushing weight. James hadn't died in an accident. He was targeted by Marcus Sterling, using his old military contacts from Argos, to secure stolen, high-value cargo. I had the motive, the order, and the executioner. I looked around the quiet, opulent study. This man had built his empire on the death of my husband. And he was about to tie my son to his criminal legacy. I knew I couldn't take the entire box. It would be missed immediately. I grabbed my simple, worn cell phone from my bag. It wasn't a smartphone, it had no tracking features. It had a low-quality camera. I worked quickly, silently. I photographed the key pages, the disposal authorization, JD, with M. Sterling's signature, the internal investigation header, and the Argos Maritime Solutions personnel sheet with the spear and globe logo. The flash was minimal, barely visible in the dark room, a tiny, necessary crime. I finished the photography. I put the files back into the wooden box in the exact order I had found them. I closed the lid. It clicked shut. I stood over the desk, the small box of secrets seeming to pulse in the darkness. My heart was no longer beating with fear or rage. It was beating with a terrible, absolute coldness. I put the remote back on the tray in the hallway, pushing the door to the study shut. I waited for the heavy magnetic thud. Click. The lock engaged. The secret was sealed again. I walked back down the hallway. My body felt light, almost detached. The old, simple clothes I wore felt heavy with purpose. I was no longer the simple mother. I was the silent witness with the proof hidden in my phone. I went back to the kitchen and drank the cold, bitter coffee in one long, deliberate swallow. It tasted like metal and resolution. I knew I couldn't leave yet. I had the proof, but I needed the confession. I needed to see their face when the absolute truth was placed on their polished marble table. I walked to the window, the city glinting beneath the pale sun. I would give them back their distraction. I would go to the jewelry district. But the real treasure I carried was not a diamond. It was justice. And it was waiting for the right moment to shatter their glass world. The jewelry district had been a deliberate blur of light and distraction. Expensive glass cases, silent security guards, the cold weight of gold. I had moved through it all like a ghost, my mind focused entirely on the image on my phone. The signature. The word sabotage. I made my excuses early. A simple woman, overwhelmed by the sparkle. I was driven back to the apartment alone, the perfect opportunity. I waited until the Sterlings returned, around 4 in the afternoon. I waited until I heard the heavy, deliberate thud of the study door closing behind Mr. Marcus Sterling. He was back in his sanctuary. I walked to the living room. Mrs. Vivian Sterling was there, rearranging a bowl of white lilies, her back to me. I stood in the vast, polished entryway. I didn't announce myself. I simply waited. Mrs. Sterling finally turned, sensing my presence in the unnatural silence. She registered my appearance. I was still wearing the same faded dress, the same worn shoes. But my posture was different. My spine was straight. My gaze was fixed. She smiled, a thin, tired contraction of her lips. Eleanor. You're back. I hope the afternoon wasn't too taxing. You should rest before dinner. She was offering me the door back to my simple, contained role. I won't be needing dinner, Mrs. Sterling, I said. My voice was low. Not loud, but perfectly steady. Every word felt carved from stone. The unexpected firmness of my tone made her pause her work. She lowered the vase slowly, deliberately, setting it down on the marble table with a quiet clink. She faced me fully now, her polite confusion shifting into a subtle, rigid alarm. I don't understand. Is something the matter? Yes, I confirmed. Something is very much the matter. I walked further into the room, stopping halfway between the entrance and the study door. A physical challenge to their space. The problem is not the wedding, Mrs. Sterling. The problem is the foundation this wedding is built upon. She went rigid. Her hands, still clasped around the vase, tightened, the knuckles turning white against the polished ceramic. I think you're overwrought, Eleanor. Perhaps you should wait until Ethan is here to discuss anything important. She was trying to deploy her son as a defense. Trying to push me back into the role of the frail mother. Ethan will not be part of this conversation, I stated. This is between us. Between the wife who knows, and the woman who ordered it cleaned up. Her breath hitched audibly. She didn't gasp, but the quick, sharp intake of air was louder than any shout. Her eyes widened, losing their control. I don't know what you are talking about, she whispered. Her voice was thin, sharp with panic, but she clung desperately to the denial. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. I had her fear. I turned my head toward the heavy mahogany door of the study. I know what is in that room, Mrs. Sterling. And I know what it took to put it there. Mrs. Sterling's composure cracked entirely. She took a quick step toward the study door, as if she could physically guard the secrets inside. Marcus. She called, her voice strained, a frantic plea. Marcus, come out here. I waited. The heavy door opened slowly. Mr. Sterling stood there. He was still in his suit, his face tired, impatient. He looked annoyed at the disruption. He saw the fear on his wife's face and then he saw me, standing still, my expression utterly devoid of my usual simplicity. His own face did not change dramatically, but the exhaustion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard focus. The look of a man who suddenly sees an unforeseen threat. What is it, Vivian? He asked, his voice low, a warning more than a question. Mrs. Sterling gestured toward me, her hand shaking. She knows something. She is talking about the accident. The files. Mr. Sterling looked at me then. His gaze was absolute. It swept over me, trying to find the crack in my defense. He saw the simple dress, the worn shoes. And he dismissed it. Nonsense, Eleanor. You're confused. You need to leave this house now before you ruin your son's future. Don't mistake our generosity for weakness. He took one step out of the study. He tried to reclaim the command of the room. I held my ground. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it quiet, compelling. The mistake was yours, Mr. Sterling. You thought a simple woman couldn't read a scar. I watched his hand. The one with the faint white line across the back. His eyes dropped instinctively to his own hand. He stiffened. The arrogance faltered, replaced by a momentary flash of disbelief. And you were too careless to hide the trophy. That specific service badge, Mr. Sterling. The spear and the globe. Argos Maritime Solutions. A very specialized logistics firm that handles operational deficiencies. A firm with old, deep ties to the harbor. He was silent. Completely, profoundly silent. His face was a mask of cold, internal calculation. He was assessing the damage. Determining how I could possibly know. I didn't wait for him to speak. I moved to the final piece of evidence. And you were too arrogant to lock the memory away. I saw the files, Mr. Sterling. The wood box on your desk. The internal investigation report from Sea Wave Logistics. I paused. I let the name of the firm, James's last employer, hang in the air. The report that proved the container fatality of JD was not a malfunction, but intentional sabotage. The report you signed, authorizing the neutralization of the auditor who knew too much. I pulled out my phone. The small, simple phone that held the high-resolution photographs of his signed confession. I held it up, not showing them the screen, but simply presenting the object that contained their destruction. Mr. Sterling's control vanished. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. The stillness broke into raw, furious movement. You little. He started, his voice a low, strangled curse. He lunged toward me, his hands raising slightly. I didn't flinch. I stood perfectly still. You touch me, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice cutting through his rage, and those files go public immediately. That is my protection. You ruined my life once. You will not touch my son. He stopped inches from me. His breath was shallow, hot, reeking of expensive anxiety. He was trapped. Mrs. Sterling let out a small, high-pitched noise, not quite a scream, more like a choked sob of pure terror. She rushed forward, grabbing her husband's arm, pulling him back. "Marcus! Stop! Stop it, you idiot! Look at her! She's telling the truth." She turned to me, her composure gone. Tears streamed down her face, ruining the expensive makeup. "Please, Eleanor. Please. Don't do this. We can pay you. Anything you want. Just tell us what you want. The firm will collapse. Ethan will be ruined." She was begging, her voice high and desperate. Her fear of financial and social collapse was far greater than any moral shame. I looked directly at Mr. Sterling, ignoring his wife's hysteria. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His initial denial was useless. He was beaten by the evidence. "I came here for one thing, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice a cold steel blade. "The truth. I have the truth now. I didn't come here for vengeance. I came here for justice." He finally spoke, his voice hoarse, broken. "It was business. Just business. James. James was going to expose the illegal movement of the assets. He was a liability. You don't understand the scale. The risk. It had to be done." He confessed it. Quietly. In the living room of his pristine home. The murder of my husband, reduced to a financial necessity. I felt a sudden rush of cold, profound emptiness. 30 years of pain, summed up in the word liability. "My husband was an honest man," I replied. "And he died for your greed." Mrs. Sterling was clutching my arm now, pleading. "The wedding, Eleanor. Think of Chloe. Think of Ethan. If the firm falls, Marcus goes to prison, and they lose everything. You ruin their future, too." I looked down at her hysterical face. She was right. I couldn't sacrifice my son's happiness or Chloe's innocence for my own revenge. I tightened my grip on the small phone. The evidence was secured. "I want the truth acknowledged," I said. "Not publicly. Not yet. But in a format that protects me, and protects Ethan, forever." I stepped back, away from Mrs. Sterling's desperate touch. I dictated my terms to the two terrified, defeated people. A full, handwritten confession of the internal investigation, detailing the true cause of James Davies's death, notarized and signed by Mr. Sterling. The confession would be placed in a sealed safe deposit box that only I could access. In return, the evidence on my phone would remain private. I would not ruin their world. Mr. Sterling, defeated, nodded slowly. His face was gray, the arrogance entirely stripped away. He was just an old, tired man facing ruin. "And you will remove yourself entirely from Ethan and Chloe's financial lives. No more promises of future employment. No more asset management. You cut the connection. Completely." He agreed. A small, defeated whisper. I walked to the vast window. The sun was low, throwing long, gold shadows across the city. The beautiful, treacherous city. I looked at the phone in my hand. Justice secured, not with noise, but with quiet, absolute leverage. I left the Sterlings in the living room. Mrs. Sterling was sobbing quietly into her husband's shoulder. Mr. Sterling was staring blankly at the marble floor. I walked to my room. I packed my small canvas bag. The fear was gone. The rage was contained. Only a profound, heavy sadness remained. I had destroyed their life, but I had saved my son's. I stood by the guest room door, ready to leave. I had one final thing to do, call Ethan, and tell him I was coming home. The wedding, I decided, would proceed. But the secrets of the past would remain sealed, a quiet, protective weapon in my hand. The only question that remained, could Chloe ever forgive the cost of her quiet life? The air in the living room was thick, tasting of salt and expensive fear. The storm had passed, leaving behind a devastation that was internal, quiet, and complete. Mr. Marcus Sterling sat heavily on the white sofa, his face still mottled, his hands pressed together between his knees. He looked decades older. Mrs. Vivian Sterling was kneeling on the floor beside the marble table, collecting the crumpled tissues she had wept into. Her eyes were swollen, vacant. I stood by the window, the cell phone, the weapon tucked back into my worn canvas bag. I had the confession. The handwritten acknowledgement of the intentional sabotage signed by M. Sterling. A separate, official-looking statement on his firm's letterhead, notarized quickly by his in-house counsel, whom I insisted be called immediately. It was placed in a thick, sealed envelope. Not for the police. Not yet. But for the future. The silence was total now, broken only by the soft, ragged sound of Mrs. Sterling's breathing. I walked away from the window, my steps slow and deliberate. I stopped before them. I had shed the simple mother act, but I wasn't the furious avenger either. I was just a woman, tired, carrying 30 years of resolved grief. It is done, I stated, my voice low and flat. The envelope is sealed. You will not hear from me, and the world will not hear the truth, as long as you adhere to the terms. Mr. Sterling lifted his head slowly. His eyes met mine not with hatred, but with a deep, chilling emptiness. The terms, he repeated, his voice husky, stripped of its former command. You demand nothing but silence. No money. Why? He couldn't understand it. He only understood transactions. You took an honest man's life for money, I answered. I will not dishonor his memory by trading his truth for your gold. I knelt down, level with Mrs. Sterling, who flinched slightly at my proximity. My only currency is the safety of my son, I said to her. You will withdraw all promise of support, all offers of future employment. You will cut the financial lifeline completely. Ethan must never be tied to this firm, or to your world, again. Mrs. Sterling nodded frantically, desperate for the easy way out. Yes. We agree. Completely. We will tell him the market is too unstable. That he needs to find his own way. No lies directed at him, I corrected. Just distance. Absolute distance. You treat him as if he has chosen a different path entirely. You give them your blessing, and then you step back into the shadows you came from. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my bag. It felt heavy with the weight of both the past and the future. My purpose was complete. I had achieved the quiet justice James deserved, and secured the protection Ethan needed. I was ready to leave the cage. But as I turned to walk toward the elevator, I heard a small sound from the far end of the hallway. A faint, almost inaudible catch of breath. I stopped instantly. My body turned slowly toward the sound. The light in the hallway was muted, shadows clustering near the door frames. Chloe was standing there. Near the entrance to her own bedroom. She was frozen in place. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her parents. She must have returned early. She must have been there in the hallway, listening to the final, brutal exchange. To her father's confession. To her mother's desperate pleas about the collapse. Her face was pale, utterly drained of color. Her eyes were wide, focused not on the elegant furniture, but on the two broken figures across the room. She saw them as they truly were, exposed, guilty, terrified. I held her gaze. I didn't offer comfort or apology. I couldn't. Mr. Sterling, realizing his daughter was standing there, let out a low, guttural sound, a mixture of shame and despair. Chloe. Go to your room. He commanded, his voice cracking, the command utterly hollow. Chloe didn't move. She didn't acknowledge him. She slowly shifted her gaze from her parents back to me. Her eyes held an immense, devastating question. A question I couldn't answer with words. Was this real? Was this the truth of my life? I walked slowly toward her. My heart felt heavy, aching not for myself, but for the beautiful, fragile hope she had built her life upon. I stopped a short distance from her. I kept my voice low, for her ears alone. I came here for my husband, Chloe. For a piece that was stolen from me 30 years ago. I paused. I was giving her the truth, raw and unadorned. Your father gave me that piece. The cost was, the truth of who they are. I didn't try to poison her against Ethan. I didn't try to sever the connection. The weight of the decision had to be hers. She was the innocent casualty of this war. Chloe finally lowered her head, closing her eyes tightly. A single, perfect tear tracked a path through the powder on her cheek. She opened her eyes and looked at me again. The quiet despair I had seen the day before was now profound knowledge. All this time, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The money. The silence. It was all built on murder. The word was terrible in the polished, silent room. I nodded slowly, gently. Yes. It was. I reached into my bag and took out the small, simple phone. I held it out to her, flat in my palm. I have the proof. The documentation. The authorization signed by your father. It is sealed away, for protection. Not vengeance. I let the weight of that object, the simple, dark phone, represent the burden of the crime. She didn't touch it. Her eyes remained fixed on it. If you tell Ethan, I continued, my voice measured, you will destroy him. You will destroy them completely. And you will destroy the only good thing I have left in this world. I was placing the final, impossible condition not on the Sterlings, but on the daughter who was already broken. Your parents will honor the deal. They will leave you and Ethan alone. You can build your quiet life with him. But you will be the only one who carries this knowledge. The only one who knows the truth of the foundation. It was the ultimate sacrifice I was asking her to make, live a beautiful lie to protect the man she loves, knowing the horrible truth about her origins. She looked past me, toward her parents, who were now watching the silent exchange with desperate intensity. Her love for Ethan warred with the knowledge of her father's monstrous crime. Her face was a landscape of this internal, desperate battle. She finally focused on me again. Her face was set, resolute, but her eyes were still haunted. I won't tell him, she said, her voice dry, absolute. I won't tell Ethan. The promise was the final piece of my justice. Ethan was safe. I nodded, a single, decisive motion. I knew her promise was steel. I placed the phone back in my bag. The exchange was complete. I took one final look at the devastation I had wrought, the necessary ruin. I didn't say goodbye to the Sterlings. They were already ghosts, confined to their expensive prison of shame. I turned and walked toward the elevator. The door to my small, quiet life. As I reached the threshold, I paused. My hand rested on the brass of the elevator door. I looked back. Chloe was still standing in the hallway. She hadn't moved. She was a statue of quiet, immense grief. She was now tied to her father's crime by her silence. Bound to the man she loved by her lie. The elevator doors slid open with a gentle sigh. I stepped inside. The descent was smooth, silent. I looked at my reflection in the dark, polished door. I saw the simple woman, but her eyes were ancient. I had justice. I had protection. But I had left the burden of a terrible, quiet truth on the shoulders of my future daughter-in-law. Could she truly live a life of peace, knowing that the man she was marrying was protected by her secret deal with the man who murdered his father? I stepped out of the tower and into the pale afternoon light of the city. The weight of the world felt lighter, but the burden of a shared silence felt heavier than any gold. I had secured a life for my son. But I wondered what kind of life Chloe had just chosen for herself. I had to leave now, before the foundation of their new, fragile happiness truly began to crack.